Good morning, everybody. Today's Torah portion is known as Pinchas or Phineas, and it covers Numbers 25, verse 10 to 30, verse 1. And then certain portions say that the Haftarah is in Jeremiah, and certain places it says in 1 Kings 18 to 1 Kings 19. I like the one in 1 Kings 18 and 19, and I will explain that just a little bit later. So our Torah portion is now going to kick off from last week, where we started talking about Balak and Balaam. And we kind of ended on a cliffhanger with this Balak and Balaam, and we got introduced to Phineas in last week's portion already. But this week, there's something else about Phineas that the Torah wants to teach us, and I want to look into that just for a second. So if we look at the outline of this Torah portion, it starts with the Zeal of Phineas from verse 10. And then in Numbers 26, there's a census of this new generation that's about to enter the land. Now, I've listened to a couple of any one of you that like to listen to numbers and the meaning behind numbers and are very number orientated. There's some great teachings on Beth Tikkun about the different numbers and what it means. So there's quite a number of teachings regarding that. Then in Numbers 27, we get to be introduced to the daughters of Zelophehad. And these 5 daughters, we see that they actually ask for some inheritance, and we're going to see what happens there. And then in Numbers 27, a little bit later on, we see that Joshua is appointed as Moses' successor. And it's between Numbers, the Zeal of Phineas, and Joshua's new appointment, where the 1 Kings comes in. Because in 1 Kings 18 and 19, we see that it's the story about Elijah giving his mantle to Elijah, also a prophet giving over his mantle to his new generation, to the new prophet. So in that way, there's a connect. And a lot of the Jewish teachings that I've listened to actually connects Phineas as a prophet like Elijah and Elijah. So there's that connection as well. But in any case, moving forward, Numbers 28 and 29 talks about all the offerings that should be brought during festivals. And these festivals are not only the 8 festivals that we read in Leviticus 23, but it also includes the festivals of the new moon and so forth. So it's very interesting, but I want to look at this from a different perspective. All right. So in order to start our Torah portion for today, we just need to recap where we ended last week. So if we go back to Numbers 25, 1 to 9, we see that this whole story between Balaam and Balak and Phineas gets introduced to us in this portion. This is now last week's portion, and we see in last week's portion that the people began to war with the daughters of Moab, and these daughters started inviting the people to start an offering to their gods. And the people did. They started yoking themselves with Baal Peor. And last week we said Baal Peor is this worldly idol that dictates that there's no boundaries. You can go ahead with all of your fleshly desires. And there was a lot of emphasis on the sexual iniquities that they were allowed to do with this. So that was Baal Peor. And then Yeshua and Yahweh said, no, but take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord might turn away from Israel. Verse 5, and Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves with Baal Peor. One of the people of Israel then came into this, they were at the entrance of the tent of meetings, and this man of Israel brought a Midianite woman to this gathering, and they started fornicating in the tabernacle in front of Moses and the leaders. So that is the picture that is happening over here. And then we get introduced to Phineas, verse 7 to verse 8, when it says, and when Phineas saw it, it's now this horrific thing that is happening in front of them. He rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand. Verse 8, and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague of the people of Israel was stopped. And we kind of stopped last week at this section where Phineas killed these two people, but now we're not sure what's now going to happen with Phineas. What is the consequence of his act? And that is where we start this week's Torah portion, which starts with the zeal of Phineas. Now, if we start reading from last week to this week's portion, the questions start arising. Everybody saw this man entering the tabernacle with his Midianite prostitute, and they were doing all this vulgarity, and Moses at that stage was still the leader of the people, but why didn't any of them respond to this immediate vulgarity and this act of wickedness that happened right in front of them? Yes, Moses did send out the decree to kill every person that gives them over to Baal Peor, but yet again, we don't see that they are actually acting upon this. And then what Phineas did by piercing these two people can be considered murder, first of all. Second of all, the fact that it happened inside the tabernacle could have been something so much more, and it could have been really something that he had to face. But it was not murder, it was called a justified killing. So, and at the end, we see that God actually rewards him with a covenant of peace. So the question is, why was Phineas allowed to do this, and then on top of that gets rewarded for this? And that is where our Torah portion of today starts. In Numbers 25, verse 10, I'm just going to start reading from verse 10 to 13, and you'll see in blue that I've added, and this is my own little bracket portion. Every time it talks about jealousy, I added the word zealous or zeal. And the reason for that is between the different Bibles and the different translations. Some translations talks about jealousy, other talks about zealousness. And they use these two terms interchangeably a lot of the time. But I like the word zeal and the translation of zeal a little bit better than jealousy. So hence I have added the zeal. So we start with verse 10, which says, and the Lord said to Moses, Phineas has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was zealous with my zealousness among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my zeal. I gave to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. So it is this 3 verses with the word jealousy or zeal that is constantly being mentioned. And that made me ask, what is the zeal that is being talked about? Because every time that you think of a group that is extremely zealous, there's usually not a positive connotation to that zealousness. It is this reaction to what you believe in, to the extent that you disregard what everybody else believes in. And we see that this word zeal has got a double meaning. And I like the way that in one of Grant Luton's teachings, he actually told a story to explain zeal. And I found that very enlightening. So I want to repeat the story, maybe not word for word, but here goes. He tells the story of these two neighbors. And the one neighbor went over and asked whether he can borrow money from his neighbor, and he will pay back his neighbor in a week's time. So a week goes by, and this guy is not paying back the money, and he's not paying back. So this new neighbor decided, okay, no, but I'm going to ask for my money. And when he went to the guy and said, listen, you are still owing me money, please pay it back. The guy said, I never borrowed money from you. I don't owe you anything. And this neighbor became very angry because now this guy is denying what happened. And he decided, no, but the only way to confront this person is to bring him to the elders of the church and let the elders of the church then deal with this whole scenario. And when they got to the elders of the church, these elders decided, no, but the only thing that they can make this guy do is make him swear on something that they considered to be holy, which was the Bible or the Torah. So they made this guy swear and said, okay, but tell the truth. With your hand on the Bible, did you borrow money from this guy or did you not borrow money from your neighbor? And this guy said, no, I didn't borrow any money from this guy. And this neighbor that was the one that gave out the money became extremely furious and angry. And I said, how can anybody allow a person to swear on the Bible knowing that it's a lie? That is a sin. That's atrocity. How can anybody allow this to happen? You are a nest of vipers if you allow this kind of acts in the church. And to the extent this neighbor left the church because he decided he cannot deal with this type of scenario. So fast forward in this guy's future. This is now the guy that lent the money to his neighbor. Went to a new congregation, sat in this new congregation. About a year later, the same thing happens. Two neighbors, not including himself this time, once again borrowed money from one another. Once again, the guy that borrowed the money denied that he borrowed the money. Again, they got challenged in front of the congregation, and this guy again swore on the Bible, saying, no, he's innocent. He did not borrow money. But this time around, the first guy said, no, it's fine. It sounds like this guy can actually be innocent. How would we know whether he's lying? And he was absolutely fine with this guy swearing on the Bible. And that is when it hit him that the first time he got so angry because his neighbor swore on the Bible was not because of the act of swearing on the Bible, but it was because he wanted his money back and he wanted people to believe that he actually borrowed this guy's money. Whereas in this new scenario, he had no emotional investment in it, so he couldn't see anything wrong with exactly the same act that took him out of his previous congregation. So the question is, what's the difference between the two? The big difference in this guy's zeal was his emotion. And that is what I want to talk about. That duality of zeal. To be a zealous person is somebody who is very poised and committed to his position and will. Now, zealousness can have a positive or a negative effect. And in the story, I try to convey the negative type of zeal, where you get angry because somebody is swearing on the Bible, but the intention and internal motive of the heart is not really about the act itself, but because there's something different, there's something hidden behind that. And this is where we get to learn about Phineas, because let me continue first with zealousness and its positive and negativity, which is going to be tested by the internal motive and the emotions of the heart behind everything. And Philippians 2 verse 3 to 6 says, do not from selfish ambition or conceit, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. And it goes on to tell that we should act in the way that Yeshua did, by humbling ourselves. And I want to say, I think that was the zeal of Phineas. He acted not from his own internal motives for something else, for revenge or hatred on these two people, but he had knowledge of the Torah, the wisdom to understand where to appropriate this. He had love and hope, passion and discernment, and his intentions were good. It was not selfish. It was not born out of conceit. And that's where we see that Phineas did not act out of his own emotions or vengeance, but he acted out of God's emotion or vengeance. His own ego was nullified. There was nothing about himself in this act of killing these people. He had no agenda, no political grounds in order to do this. His intentions was pure, and that was to sanctify God, despite of the dangers that's attached to that. Because remember, at that point where he pierced the people, it's still not known what is going to happen with Phineas. Is he going to have to die for his act, even though it's declared righteous or not? So he acted. He was not only a hearer of this decree, but he acted. He became a doer. Unlike Moses and the leaders, or the leaders at that point that just stood in front of the meeting, the tent of meeting, weeping. He actually sprang into action. He did something. He did an extra act. In James 1, verse 19 to 23, we see, especially in verse 22, but be doers of the word, not hearers only, because that is deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. And the next verse says, and then he forgets his face after he looked in the mirror. So we see that at this stage, Moses and the elders at that point were hearers of the word, but Phineas was a doer. And that brings us, let's jump back again, that brings me to the zeal of Phineas. The zeal of Phineas was not just to stand and listen to this word, but to spring into action, to do something, but to sanctify God. Nothing out of himself came from this act of zealousness, first of all. Second of all, we know that Phineas later on is going to become inaugurated into the priesthood because of his act. So at this stage of the Torah portion, all the old leaders are now going to or have already died. In the previous Torah portion, we learned about Miriam that died. We know that Aaron has died. And a little bit later in this Torah portion, we also hear about Moses' death. So we know that there's a whole new leadership that's going to be inaugurated in this portion. There's a whole new generation that is in this portion. And Phineas gives us the first view of this new generation, what makes this new generation different from the previous one, and is the fact that they act. They are not hearers, but they are also doers of the word. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later again. I want to move into the wilderness. The book of Numbers is divided into two sections, and it accounts for us the characteristics of two types of generations. The first generation came out of slavery in Egypt and went into the wilderness eventually to die. And we see that in Numbers, from Numbers 1 up till the Torah portion of Korach, that this is the generation that died in the wilderness. Then we could also get introduced to a second generation. This is the generation that came out of the wilderness, but their view and their mindset was to conquer the land. And this is the generation that we learn and get introduced to from the Torah portion of Balak until the end of Numbers. And it's going to continue into Deuteronomy as well. What this tells us, if we compare these two generations, is that both of these two generations went into the wilderness. So that is not a question. Is everybody is eventually going to face a wilderness in their life, in their walk. And a wilderness is a place where we get prepared to conquer the land. So it's a preparation time. Now, I was thinking this morning of knowing where this Torah portion is heading and what I've written down. I thought that it might be good to just take a pause over here and just explain something. What is this wilderness that we keep on talking about? And a lot of times it's a place where that we fear, because we know what happens in the wilderness. As you can see on the picture to your right, there's nothing in the wilderness. There's nothing beautiful in the wilderness. There's no food. There's no water inside this wilderness, although we are all called to go into a wilderness. So it's a place that actually can strike a lot of stress and fear and create a lot of anxiety in ourselves. But also remember, as we continue with our conversation on the wilderness, that the wilderness was also a place of miracles. It was a place of divine protection. It is a place where God literally took care of the needs of his people, from the soles of their foot to whatever they had to eat. Their shoes never worn out, their clothes never worn out. They had food, they had water. They had, to the extent some of the Jewish sages say, that every time that they set up camp in the wilderness and this well of Miriam gave forth its water, that on the sides of the well, fruit trees sprung up, bearing fruits out of season, and every month there was new fruits on these fruit trees. So the place of wilderness, even though this is a place where we get prepared for what to come, it's not a place to be feared. And then a lot of people, and I've heard this and I've even thought about this to myself, is if we look at real life examples of what is a wilderness, a lot of people say, oh, I was in a very bad marriage for very long, so that is my wilderness. No, that's your Egypt. Your Egypt is that bad marriage. Your Egypt is going to counseling and trying to work on the marriage and eventually see, but okay, we cannot work on it. We have to divorce. After the divorce, after the Egypt, that's when the wilderness begins. That is when the healing process starts. So that's the wilderness. People say that, oh, I was struck with, the Lord gave me this horrible disease in order to teach me something. No, that's Egypt. The disease, when the disease gets healed, that's when you move out of Egypt into your wilderness. So what you do with your healing and how you are treating this healing after, that's examples of a wilderness. All right. So it's very important that we discern what is wilderness in our lives and what is Egypt in our lives, and not to confuse the two, because sometimes we are stuck in Egypt and we blamed God for that. All right. So moving on, we know that everybody has to go through a wilderness. This is what we see in these two generations. Both of them had to go through the wilderness. But the first generation, who was supposed to spend only 11 days in the wilderness, got stuck in the wilderness for 40 years. And it's not because of the wilderness that got them stuck. It's because they traveled out of Egypt, but they kept Egypt in their hearts. And it took God 40 years to get Egypt out of their hearts. And that's why they got stuck in the wilderness. So how long you are inside your wilderness, your time of wilderness, that's up to you. That is your heart that you have to deal with. Now, what is the purpose of a wilderness? The purpose of a wilderness is not only to prepare you, but it's also there to break you and kill you, because only through death can you move into the new land. Now, that sounds extremely ominous and very sad, and again, you just said the wilderness is not a place to be feared. And here you tell me this is a place that's going to break and kill you. So two things are being said. No. If you keep on remembering all the miracles and things that happens, we have to look at, but why do I need to get broken and killed? What about that is in our journey? So I want to detour a little bit and ask the question, but why do we have to die? It sounds so final and it sounds really morbid. And that brings me back to Genesis 1, verse 26. When God created man, he said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Okay, so this is when God created Adam. And that word likeness is this Hebrew word that I'm not going to try to pronounce because I can't. All right, but if we look at this Hebrew word and we start breaking this Hebrew word for likeness apart, we start with this letter of Dalet. And Dalet means it's a door or a pathway of life. And then the word that's after the Dalet is the word in Hebrew for death, which means when we want to become more in God's likeness, we have to move through a door, a pathway of life into death. And that's how he is going to create his likeness in us. And that's the purpose of the wilderness, to create the doorway to death unto ourselves. And this sentiment is echoed in John 12, verse 24, where Yeshua speaks and says, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears fruit. So the minute that we die and we move through this doorway onto death in this wilderness, becoming more like God, we start bearing fruit. Our spirits have to be crushed and bruised and broken in this wilderness. And again, that sounds like something that is very painful and very anxious in inducing. situations. But what does it mean to be crushed and to be broken in your spirit? And why? Why does my spirit need to be crushed and broken? In Isaiah 66, verse 2, it says, "For all these things my hand has made." So all these things came into being by and for me. This is God speaking, declares the Lord. "But to this one I will look graciously, to him who is humble and contrite in spirit." So in Isaiah 66:2, we see that God says those ones that have a bruised and crushed, that word contrite is crushed, means crushed. And God said, to that person, I will look upon graciously. Psalm 51:70 says, "My only sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit." And again, here we see that word broken, a broken and contrite heart. And that brokenness and contrite, those words, if you take it in Hebrew, Hebrew was written in the form of pictures before it became letters and then constructed into sentences and that which we see today. So the picture that's beyond or that paints this word for broken is, first of all, olives that are being crushed and bruised and broken in order to bring forth its oil. That's the first picture that gives you the idea of why we have a broken spirit, so that it will produce the oil. And that is the fruit that John 12 was talking about. Another picture, I think this one was more related to contrite than the broken. The contrite, the crushed component, was spices that needs to be crushed in order to bring forth their fragrance. And we see everywhere that the Bible or the Torah talks about an offering. It always talks about the fragrance that's attached to the offering. And we know from Romans that we are supposed to be the living sacrifices. That means if we are crushed in the wilderness, that we are going to produce a fragrance that's acceptable and sweet to our God. That's why we go through a wilderness. So if we move to the two generations and looking at the characters of these two generations, we see that the first character, the one that came out of slavery, went into the wilderness under the leadership of Moses, Aaron, as well as Miriam. It's a character of passivity. And this is not in a negative sense. They were all about receiving God's Torah and being receptive to his will. They were led by divine will, and that divine will took them into signs and wonders. And all of that prepared them to receive the Torah in its fullness. We see that their relationship, this generation that came out of Egypt, that their relationship with God, their service to him, was based on just being a vessel and receiving the Torah. And we see this mimic in the words in Exodus 14:14, where it says, "The Lord will fight for you while you need only to keep silent and remain calm." So this is the character of this generation, one of passivity, listening, receiving. Under Moses' leadership, which was the dominating factor also in this generation's relationship to God. So if God wanted to speak to the people, he had to do it through Moses. If the people wanted to speak to God, they had to do it through Moses and Aaron. So there was always this go-between for this generation in the form of Moses. And again, I'm going to say this is not in a negative sense. There's a time period in all of our lives that you do need somebody to guide you, to mentor you into a relationship with God. There's somebody that you can see and look at and understand, oh, but this is what it looks like to have a relationship. We all need that. So this is not in the negative sense. All right. So they experienced this whole life of transcendence through Moses and the priesthood, and everything was a gift from God. But now the second generation, and the character of the second generation, is a generation of individuals that has to assert themselves, and they cannot depend on their leadership to create this relationship for them anymore. And just think about it in a logical terms. This is a generation that is going to take the land, and they're going to spread very far apart from one another. Although there's going to be a central place for the temple or the tabernacle to be erected, still these people are going to be dispersed across a very wide area, much bigger and wider than the space that they had in their encampments during the wilderness, which means that they will have to find their own way to connect with God without a constant temple service right at their front doors. So they had to find their own way. So the emphasis for this new generation shifts from Moses as a go-between to the entire nation that has now to take the responsibility of creating a relationship with God. So when entering the land, they will become active partners with God to bring forth their own redemption. The parents are going to teach their children about the Torah that they heard and were taught in the wilderness. That is how they're going to become active, serving God through a self-motivated action, self-generated actions. So they're not going to be called out by Moses anymore. They have to generate their own way to create their relationship with God. So this requires man to take the first step, to take or make the first move, take initiative. And think about this just for a second. In the wilderness, God gave them manna to eat and he gave them water to drink. Now moving into the land, they have to pray and follow the instructions regarding the seasons. Sow and reap comes into play. They have to pray for the rain to come down as water. So it's not a giving anymore. It's upon their action they get the blessing. So we see Phineas's action that we got introduced to, introducing the character of this new generation, speaks of a new type of zealousness towards God. It's a man of action. It represents a new generation of action that will rectify their own redemption upon their actions. So if they don't follow the law of sowing and reaping within seasons, they're going to reap the actions of that. They're not going to receive manna anymore. They have to produce their own food. And we once again see this generation's character being summed up in Numbers 25, when it says, where the Lord spoke to Moses saying, provoke hostilities with the Midianites, attack them. So if you compare it with the Exodus 14:14, where they had to remain silent and calm, once again, they are now called into action. They are action-driven generation. So this also connects to the other portions of this parasha, this action-driven generation. We see this in the daughters Zelophehad. These 5 women, their dad died and he never bore a son. So these were 5 women that, according to the law as it stood at that stage, would not inherit a place or a land at that anywhere. as they go into the land. So these women took initiative, they took action, and they went to Moses and say, please ask, can we also inherit land, even though we are not men? And they did this action not out of feminism or trying to make statements about equality between men and women, because they were righteous women. They were motivated by their love of the land, as well as they had this vision of becoming mothers of the nations. Their feelings were aligned with God's will. Therefore, their action and their initiative was aligned. God just waited for them to ask. And I think that is a lot of times where we fall short. We think, oh, but God knows my heart. But Matthew 7 verse 7 says, ask and keep on asking. Take that initiative, take that prayer time. James 1 verse 5 says, anybody that lacks wisdom, go and ask of God, and God will give it to you generously. So again, it's an action and initiative that is first your step, then God's reaction to that. So what is the plan of action if you go into this new land? If you come out of your wilderness and you move into this new land, we actually get taught that in Numbers 28 and 29, where we get taught about the different offerings. But there's one of these offerings that is known in Jewish tradition as the Musaf offerings. And they are the offerings that's additional to all the festival offerings, where it said, you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord every day, once in the morning and once in the evening. So your offering is what is going to be that additional step. Only in Numbers 28 do we find this Musaf offerings, once in the evening, once in the morning, once in the evening, allowing people to elevate their level of holiness. The festivals will call you to days of sanctity, challenge you to rise above the normal, but then every single day, you've got that extra level of holiness that you can step into. And all you need to do in order to do that deeper level of intimacy is to call, to pray, and to seek God daily. That is your Musaf offering. Matthew 6:6 says, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father. Now, this tells me that you have to spend a time separate from everything that is surrounding you. You have to, I almost want to say, isolate you and call to God. When Phineas wanted the priesthood, he had to take action. And that actually brought him into a realm of actuality, of being a priest according to God's heart. When the daughters of Phineas started taking action, asking, they got inheritance in the land, and God saw it as good. So when it comes to our offerings according and this new generation, examine yourself. Am I doing something because it is what God desires from me, or because of it's out of my own zeal? Examine the intentions of your own heart. Ask yourself, which one of the generations am I? Am I the one dying in the desert, or am I the one that's going to conquer the land? And remember that action is key. Sanctify your life through everything you do. Let God's will become your will. His light, His plan, His presence, and His Shekinah glory will then take action on the world. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things, the priesthood, this new leadership, this inheritance of land will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. Psalm 42 says, deep calls to deep. So your heart's intention has to call onto God above all circumstances, above everything, and to the level of depth that you call unto God. Psalm 42 says he will answer on that level. And Psalm 91 says, when he calls out to me, I will answer him. God will answer your call. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's be a generation leaving our wilderness and taking up our land with a zealousness of Phineas, with the action driven, calling onto God deep to deep. Shabbat Shalom.